I think about one of the greatest warriors in biblical history, King David.
Sure.
Right? He became the king of Judah at the age of 30 and the king of all of Israel at 37 years old. And I mean, this man, from the time he was a teenager, he killed Goliath, cut off his head, and showed the Philistines like, hey, my God is greater. He ran from Saul, but in every instance, he like did something to show Saul like, hey, I'm a little bit better, but I'm going to honor you.
Honored,
right?
At the same time.
Every time he had an enemy, he still tried to honor them. I mean, he cried over the death of somebody that he was fighting against for years, right? I think Abner was his name. He cried over that, and he was like, how could Abner die in such a dishonorable way? Like, this man David was a warrior's warrior. Do you know when he ran into trouble?
Come on, tell him.
Do you know when he ran into trouble? We all hear the story about Bathsheba bathing on the roof of her house. And it's funny because at that time, David's men were off to war. David's men were off to war.
Yeah, you're about to get into some heavy talk right now,
and I
brother.
think about this concept, right? Like, a warrior who is not at war becomes complacent. He doesn't become a gardener. He becomes complacent, and that gives room for the devil, right?
Complacency kills, man.
So David takes this other man's wife, Uriah the Hittite's wife, when he should have been at war, and he sleeps with her, and then he has Uriah the Hittite killed. You know, if David had gone to war with his men like he used to, right?
Which is what he was known for.
Which is what he was known for. He was he was very good at strategy. He was all this stuff. I mean, if he was doing what he was supposed to do in that moment, that wouldn't have happened. Now, we wouldn't have gotten Solomon, but God probably would have blessed him in another way. Right? So I think about that. I'm like, a lot of times too, yes, I have been known to be the person to go into battle and extend my supply line. But on the other hand, there are some of us who should be in battle, and we don't even show up. And then equally that gives room for the devil, right? So it's like you have both sides of that, where it's like you need to be a warrior when you need to be a warrior, but you need to make sure you hold that supply line. And then, hey, you need to be a gardener when you need to. Like there's a time and place for everything, and I see that in so many stories where it's like when we as men should be stepping up and being warriors, we fall back. And we let someone else be a warrior.
That's the podcast.
And then when we should be gardeners,
get busy, man. Nah, that's the pod. And it's so beautiful. I mean, I'm so glad you pulled that text out, because he's literally, people are like, oh man, it's Bathsheba, she's naked, he's hanging. But he was relaxing when he was supposed to be warring.
Yes.
And so the thing is, as so many men, as you mentioned it right now, are relaxed when they're supposed to be at war, and they wonder, man, why is my marriage not right? Why are my finances not? What is happening right now? Why is the enemy taking territory? Because you're not in battle.
That's right.
You're home. And so what I realized too, to take it a step further, a lot of men aren't warring because of trauma in the past.
Speak on that.
Like a lot of trauma. So it's like, how can I possibly be warring? How could I possibly be taking enemy held territory when my dad wasn't there? He didn't show me how to be a dad. You know how hard it is to be a dad, and know how hard it is to come home and be married and have to be responsible for your wife and your kids and other things. And so God's saying to war in the spirit, and we'll talk about Ephesians in a moment. But it's easier for me to retreat from my responsibilities because somebody didn't show me how to be a dad. Somebody didn't show me how to be a husband. Somebody didn't show me how to be a man of integrity and character. Yeah. And because they didn't show me, rather than me learning and fighting and warring, I'm going to retreat. And so what happens when I retreat, every time I take a step back, the enemy takes a step forward.
Yep.
And every time I take a step back, he takes another step. And every time I step back, he's taking territory.
He's not waiting.
He's not waiting. In fact, the more we wait, the more he gets, right? And so we're called to be these mighty men of God who are these warriors in a garden, yes, but warriors nonetheless. And what was happening is we're retreating and we're blaming it on somebody. And that was me, man. Oh, man, I wish my dad would have shown me. Wish my uncles would have showed me. Man, it's hard to do this, man. And so I had the opportunity to say, Bo, these things ran in my family. until they ran into me. Like no more single moms out here. No more fatherless children. No more this. No more alcoholism. No more this. It has to stop. But what's that mean? I have to go on the offensive. I have to go on the offensive in a world that wants me to be on defense. The enemy wants me to be on defense. Why? Because he's able to move the way he wants. But if I go on offense for the kingdom, I'm taking territory. I'm being assertive, and I'm going to get what's mine. David was kicking back. And I love that God shows you a picture of what it looks like when you're on defense, when you're supposed to be on offense.
That's right.
What happens, the possibilities, the things that could happen. He never would have been tempted by the butt-naked lady had he been on the battleground, right?
That's right.
And so I love that you mentioned that, and that's a word. The question is, man, are we on offense or are we on defense? And I believe we're living in a time where a lot of people are on defense, right? And it's like, well, man, I'm just waiting for what? God said you're a warrior. Go war. Right. And so, no, that's
And look what happened for the rest of David's life. He had to play defense for the rest of his life. He ran from his own kids.
Come on.
His country was under siege till he died, essentially.
Till he
so
died,
it's like,
man.
so when you concede that ground, like you said, Satan is going to keep coming. And I'm sorry, like once you start playing defense, you're going to always be on defense.
You're going to always be on
unless
defense.
you say, hey,
come on, man.
let me tap into the source. Let me tap.
Man,
let me go back to God, right, and do what God called me to do.
Come on.
Which is to be a warrior for my family, warrior for the kingdom. Let me no longer sit back and just be a gardener.
Come on.
Because, right, it says it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Come on.
So I look at that and I'm like, man, because David made that mistake, because he got lackadaisical, because he was like, okay, my men have this. They don't need me to be the leader right now. Because he did that, the rest of his life was basically a tragedy.
And people don't get that, right? Like that's the part that I wish was preached more, and I wish that we would go into that a little bit more, because David started out being on offense, right? Like he was anointed by Samuel. We recognize he was anointed, and there's obviously him being faithful, stewarding what God gave him, being and learning all the things in the field that he was going to eventually take when he became king, right? And use. But he started off on the offense. This Philistines talking about, like, is anybody going to do something about this? Like his brothers are scared. Everybody's afraid. And he's like, I'm just not going to sit back and let this man take territory.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I know I'm 100 pounds soaking wet. I know it doesn't make sense, but I'm about to I'm going to kill this guy.
Yeah.
He went on offense. And then you see what happens when, again, we talked about it earlier, God's not necessarily worried about your ability, but he'll use your availability.
That's
and
right.
what David said is he was the one guy that looked like he had no ability. You have a slingshot? You wait, how much? Saul tried to put his arm on him. He said, no, I'm good with that. Like, as long as I'm available, God will do the rest. He was on offense.
That's right.
And then you look the way he moved, and then you said it, man. He fumbled the rock when he chose to be on defense. Because I think when you're on defense, now it's like, man, how's God using that? Like God's not saying, man, you need to be the most equipped. He has you on that. He cares about your availability, not your ability. But my availability is going to be me being willing to be on offense, man, in my home, in my community, and so on and so forth. I talk about David all day, man.
And you know, and I don't want to take this scripture out of context, but he says he's a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path, right? The path is moving forward.
Come on.
It's not saying he's lighting your back.
Come on.
Right?
There's no need for a lamp if I'm walking, you know what I mean? Like to my feet.
To your feet. So it's like if David had kept, you know, and again, he was considered beloved of God and all this, but he fumbled because he stopped moving forward.
Yeah.
He stopped asking God. And here's what most people forget. Even with Bathsheba, he had several opportunities to change his mind on that. He had several opportunities to change his mind, but he didn't allow God to be the lamp unto his feet and the light unto his path. And it's so easy. And I'm not trying to say this from like a soapbox, because I fumble the rock a lot too.
I do on a day.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? But if we're conscious of that, if we're like, you know what? God says this in his word. God says this in his word. If we rely on that, especially as leaders and as leaders of men and as men, if we can consistently do that and say, God's word says this. So let me take that step towards that
100%.
and not take a step backwards. We're going to start seeing things open up for us. And it's just, it's a different world. And I'm at that place where I'm like just seeing, like, you know, I'm looking through that little glass and I'm like, oh, I'm starting to see it a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see that, right? At the age of 37, crazy to think that David was the king of Israel at my age, but I'm like, I'm just starting to see what he understood as a teenager. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the world did he fumble the rock when he understood something beyond what so many people could understand? And man, I don't want my, you know, we both have sons, and you have 2 daughters, I have 1, but I don't want my kids to grow up in a world where they're fumbling the rock because I didn't teach them
So
what God told me to teach them.
Come on.
Right.
Come on.
And I'm like, if I fumble the rock now as a husband and a father, that's generations
1 million
having to pick that thing up,
brother.
right?
Come on, like you're lifting things up generationally right now that you're like, man, like it may not be my fault, but it's my responsibility. I got to do something. You're cleaning up maybe granddad's mess, maybe dad's mess, and you're like, I don't want to. But think about how we fell. Think about the fall of man. God gave Adam a responsibility to lead, right? And so when Eve and Adam eat of the fruit, right?
He was on defense then.
Yeah, he was on defense, right? Then it's like, oh, put some clothes on, girl. Like, what are you doing? And so it's like, and then it's like, I love what God says, Adam, where are you? He didn't say Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that he wasn't disappointed with what Eve did, but he went to the person that he made responsible.
Because he gave Adam the instructions.
There you go.
He didn't give Eve the instructions.
He wasn't even here yet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
He gave Adam the instructions. And it's like,
he fumbled the rock. And so he comes, he says, Adam, he called for the person he made responsible. And the thing is, you said it, it's like, man, God made us responsible for our families. And so if he's looking at little mishaps and mistakes we're making now, when my son is 24, he may make some mistakes, but I'm going to be held responsible because he put me in position of leadership and influence. And if I wasn't intentional in those moments, like success for my family is not going to be accidental. It's going to be intentional.
Absolutely.
Right. And it's like, what can I do now being intentional in this season? Because it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen by intentionality. And that means, again, making a decision daily to go on offense, man.
That's right.